Buenas tardes. Hello, Professor Hütter. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And now we are presenting you to the people that are here and that are following us through Zoom. And, well, Profesor Reinhard Hütter es profesor ordinario de Teología Fundamental y Dogmática en la Escuela de Teología y Estudios Religiosos de la Catholic University of America. Antes, él enseñó durante 17 años Teología Sistemática y Filosofía Teológica en la Duke University, en la Escuela de Teología de la Duke University. Es miembro fundador de la Academia de Teología Católica y ha sido su presidente. Él es académico ordinario de la Pontificia Academia de Santo Tomás y miembro de la Comisión Teológica Internacional en la actualidad. Es esa comisión que asesora teológicamente a la Santa Sede, al Papa concretamente, y él pertenece a ese grupo de teólogos que se encargan de esta misión. Entre sus libros más recientes tenemos Bound for Beatitude, A Thomistic Study in Eschatology and Ethics, que está publicado en el 2019 y que es un libro que estamos a punto de traducir. We are going to translate this book and publish in Spanish. Aquinas and on Transubstantiation, también publicado en el 2019, y John Henry Newman on Truth and its Counterfeits, publicado en el 2020. Él ahora está trabajando en un libro sobre la evolución homogénea de la doctrina, ¿no? Un libro muy interesante, a very interesting book. Well, Dr. Hütter now nos va a hablar en esta conferencia sobre la necesidad de la gracia, este tema realmente tan actual y que nos da una luz sobre por qué realmente no podemos vivir sin la gracia de Dios, ¿no? Professor Hütter, thank you very much. You have the word to speak us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the Institute of St. Thomas in the Balmesiana, and especially to Professor Martinez for the kind invitation. It is always an honor for me to be involved in one of these conferences. Today I was asked to speak on the need for grace according to St. Thomas Aquinas. In order to come to a theological understanding, according to the mind of St. Thomas Aquinas, about the need for grace, it is not sufficient to turn simply to the opening question of Thomas's treatise on grace at the end of the prima secunde of the Summa Theologiae, the question de necessitate gratiae. Rather, we must turn to the very heart of St. Thomas's theological anthropology, to his teaching about the human being created by God, originally with an extraordinary gratuitous endowment, in a state of charity or friendship with God, and destined for eternal life, yet subsequently fatally estranged from God, and redeemed by God through the passion and death of Jesus Christ, the incarnate Son of God, and thereby offered in and through Christ a reconstitution to communion and friendship with God, culminating in eternal life and the beatific vision, the very perfection of human happiness. Because the whole divine economy of salvation, as conveyed by divine revelation, presupposes it, St. Thomas considers carefully the original state of the first human beings. They are constituted, according to Thomas, as rational animals, by receiving from God as the substantial form of their body a rational soul, that is an incorruptible spiritual substance that distinguishes human beings as species from all other animals. St. Thomas takes it for granted that this original state as well as its loss and all that this loss entails, and finally, what the overcoming of this loss, human redemption, means and entails, can only be known about by way of divine revelation and its inspired record in the divine scriptures. It is a proper topic of what Thomas called Sacra Doctrina, the particular scientia of Sacra Doctrina. The key notion that characterizes the original state, according to all medieval theologians, as a matter of fact, is called Justitia Originalis, original justice. It denotes a state marked by full harmony with God, in right order, in relation to God. In question 95, Article 1 of the Prima Secundae, St. Thomas identifies the inner constitution of the first human beings, their rectitude in relationship to God and in regard to the interior ordering of their various powers, the mind, the will, the emotions. It is for this reason that he relies here on Ecclesiastes 7:30. Chapter 7, verse 30. God made the human being right. Deus fecit hominem rectum. The rightness or rectitude of the initial state of the human being consists, according to St. Thomas, in, quote, his reason being subject to God, the lower powers to reason, and the body to the soul. And the first subjection was the cause of both the second and the third. Since while reason was subject to God, the lower powers remained subject to reason, unquote. This is from actually Summa Theologiae 195.1. Reason here means both mind and will. The lower powers of the soul mean sense appetites, the operations of which are the emotions. Hence, the rectitude of the original state of the human being includes the subordination of the right order of all human powers internally and of all of them together to God. Order of justice means the right balance of all powers internally and in subordination to God. This balance was gratuitously bestowed by God so that the human being would be from the first moment on of its individual and personal creation in the right relation with God. To be precise, the right relation with God, that is the subordination of reason to God, effectively causes, according to Thomas, the balance of powers within the complex human constitution. With the loss of the first element of original justice, the subordination of reason to God, also the second element, the interior subjection of the lower powers to reason, is lost. Importantly, as St. Thomas argues in question 95.1, original justice is not a property inherent to human nature, but is rather gratuitous, that is, an additional divine gift freely bestowed upon the nature of the first human. Now, crucially, this gift is bestowed by God on human nature and not on the first human being qua person. In question 100, Article 1 of the Prima Pars of the Summa, Thomas points this matter out thus, quote, original justice, in the rectitude of which the first human being was made, was an accident belonging to the nature of the species, not in the sense that it was caused by the principles of the species, but in the sense that it was a special gift given by God to the human nature as a whole, unquote. And later in the Prima Secundae, question 81, Article 2, Thomas states that, quote, original justice was a particular gift of grace divinely bestowed upon all human nature in the first parent, unquote. Hence, original justice is not something owed by God to the constitution of human nature. Original justice is emphatically not to be understood as belonging intrinsically to human nature, so that its laws would cripple human nature in such an irreversibly detrimental way that, bereft of original justice, human nature would become inherently deficient and its powers profoundly skewed, such that the existence of human beings, bereft of original justice, would be nothing but absurd. Rather, original justice is a pure gratuity, perfecting human nature on its natural level, a help, Thomas would call it, an auxilium, granted by God to human nature to set its highest power in right relation to God and thereby to overcome the defects connatural to human nature, as composed of body and rational soul. Original justice perfected original humanity in their intellectual and volitional rectitude, as well as in their physical flourishing, St. Thomas argues. As we see in the prima pares of the Summa, in question 97, article 1, Thomas argues that the indissolubility of the body of original humanity was not due to some intrinsic vigor of immortality that the body had, unlike the resurrection body, but rather that by reason of a supernatural force given by God to the soul, whereby it was enabled to preserve the body from all corruption so long as it remained itself subject to God, unquote. What needs to be considered next is whether, according to St. Thomas, the divine gift of original justice is identical with grace. After all, Thomas treats original justice in the question that asks whether the first human being was created in grace. Well, conceivably, original justice might be identical with grace. However, for one quite obvious theological reason, original justice cannot be identical with grace. For the simple reason that with baptism, grace is received, yet original justice is not. Hence, original justice and grace cannot simply be identical, but must be different, yet somehow related to one another. At this point, I need to say a few words about grace in general. First, very comprehensively, and secondly, as it pertains to the original state. Gratia, in St. Thomas's use, is an analogical notion with many nuances. First, in its widest sense, gratia denotes a freely given quality that renders the recipient pleasing. Second, in a more restricted sense, gratia denotes the help, the auxilium of the first mover, whether due to nature or above nature. That is, it can be a natural auxilium, every motion proportionate to the very nature of a being. It can be a preternatural auxilium, extraordinary strengthening, extension, or protection of natural capacities. Or C, finally, supernatural, a supernatural auxilium, for example, miracles in the strict sense. And finally, third, in its most proper sense, the sense exclusively used in the following here in my lecture, gratia denotes a strictly supernatural gift of God to the rational creature for the purpose of salvation, divinization, and eventual union with God. This is gratia gratum faciens, sanctifying grace. In the following, we are considering the need of precisely grace in this specific sense. The supernatural gift is properly an infused habitus, a quality that is supernatural and permanent, albeit forfeitable, adhering in the very essence of the recipient's spiritual soul. Yet grace in the strict sense used here can also, as I interpret Thomas, be an actual transient motion that prepares the soul for the reception of sanctifying grace. This grace is a supernatural auxilium, but since it is ordered to the reception of sanctifying grace, that is, it is a preparation for sanctifying grace, it must be understood as an actual transient grace. Regarding the effect of sanctifying grace, then, St. Thomas distinguishes between operating and cooperating grace. Both are different effects of the same grace. The effect of operating grace being that God moves while the human being is moved. The effect of cooperating grace being that God moves the human being and the human being moves him or herself, again by virtue of God's movement. In the following, we will focus on sanctifying grace, the reality in the human being that makes the human being pleasing to God. Gratia gradum faciens. St. Thomas describes this grace as an effect of God's special love, predilection, according to which he draws the rational creature above the condition of his nature to a share in the divine good itself. Prima Secunde, question 110, article 1. Sanctifying grace makes acceptable to God, that is, admits the person endowed with it to what is proper to God himself. In short, it is an inward sharing in the divine life. Let us turn now to the relationship between grace and original justice. Remember that the central characteristic of original justice is that the human reason, mind and will, is subject to God. Yet for human reason to be rightly subject to God, it must be rightly ordered to God, and the central activity of the mind and the will somehow reach God. For this to happen, human nature must receive some form of supernatural elevation that would make the actions of the mind and the will able to reach an end completely disproportionate to human nature, God. And that is precisely what sanctifying grace does. Hence, the very submission of reason to God, that is at the heart of original justice, can only be brought about by sanctifying grace. And therefore, sanctifying grace must be understood as the root and the efficient cause of original justice. It is not identical with original justice, but is its root and efficient cause. St. Thomas states in De Malo, chapter 4, article 2, that original justice includes grace, which makes the human being pleasing to God. To put it differently, for the submission of intellect and will to God to be a genuine, personal, and human submission involving the exercise of free will, there must be a prior proportioning of human nature to the supernatural end. Sanctifying grace achieves this elevation of human nature in the individual person, that is, not in human nature as such, but in the person who has a human nature. The rational soul of the person receives in its core a supernatural elevation, and with it principles of operation proportionate to a supernatural end, God. That is, supposing the exercise of free will in the order of specification and in the order of exercise. The supernatural elevation is the root and efficient cause of original justice. The supernatural submission of reason to God by way of ordering and in a certain way already uniting mind and will with God. Because the first human being was instantaneously created in original justice, God made the human being right. The very source and root causing original justice, that is sanctifying grace, must have been given to the human person from the first moment of existence on. This is the position that St. Thomas develops over the course of his teaching career against the majority of theologians, contemporaries that taught that the first human was created in original justice but received sanctifying grace at some later point before the first sin. Thomas argues that since grace is a personal gift and not a gift of nature, grace cannot be the formal cause of original justice. Grace rather must be the efficient cause of original justice. Grace does not abrogate, but rather perfects nature in the first human being by bringing about an entitative habitus, a stable disposition that rightly orders the whole human nature to God and all the powers intrinsic to the nature in their right relationship to each other. As an entitative habitus like health, original justice would have been passed on by the first parents to their children, to their progeny. Sanctifying grace would have been given by God directly and individually to the first parents' children qua persons. Consider Thomas's argument why the first parents' progeny would have received sanctifying grace at their conception. I'm quoting Thomas from Prima Pars, question 100, article 1, answer to the second objection. Since the root of original justice, which conferred rectitude on the first human being when he was made, consists in the supernatural subjection of the reason to God, which subjection results from sanctifying grace, we must conclude that if children were born in original justice, they would also have been born in grace. Thus we have said above that the first human being was created in grace. This grace, however, would not have been natural, for it would not have been transfused by the virtue of the semen, but would have been conferred on the human being immediately on his receiving a rational soul. In the same way, the rational soul, which is not transmitted by the parent, is infused by God as soon as the human body is apt to receive it, unquote. Sanctifying grace would enable the progeny of the first parents in the state of original justice to share in God's own life by a love which directs all human thinking and willing toward God above all. It is apposite at this point to turn to the first parent's sin, the first sin. St. Thomas characterizes the first parent's sin as a quintessential act of the vice of pride, coveting God's likeness inordinately by way of gaining godlike knowledge in direct contradiction of God's explicit command. Thomas discusses that in the Secunda Secundae, question 163. Secunda Secundae, question 163. This sin was most grave on account of the perfection of the state of the first parents. Recall, the first parent's sin betrayed the life of love toward God by abandoning reason's submission to God. The act of sin destroyed the entitative habitus of original justice and betrayed the friendship with God, which meant the loss of sanctifying grace. Instead of the destroyed habitus of original justice, now a habitus contrary to original justice took hold of the human being, namely the entitative habitus of original sin. At this point, I need to say something briefly about operative and entitative dispositions or habitus. Let me first quote St. Thomas from his answer to the question whether original sin is a habitus, a disposition. He states that, quote, habitus is twofold. The first is a habitus or disposition whereby power is inclined to an act. This would be an operative habitus. Thus, science and virtue are called habitus. In this way, original sin is not a habitus. The second kind of habitus, the entitative habitus, is the disposition of a complex nature, whereby that nature is well or ill disposed to something, chiefly when such a disposition has become like a second nature, as in the case of sickness or health. In this sense, original sin is a habitus, for it is an inordinate disposition arising from the destruction of the harmony which was essential to original justice, even as bodily sickness is an inordinate disposition of the body by reason of the destruction of that equilibrium which is essential to health. Hence it is that original sin is called the languor of nature. This is all from Prima Secunde, question 82, article 1. The sin of the first parent destroyed the state of original justice. Hence, from now on, their nature lacks it, and this precisely is the deprivation characteristic of original sin. And the grace that was its root and cause, the unmerited friendship with God, was withdrawn by God. All post-fall sanctifying grace now is merited by Christ's passion on the cross. All post-fall sanctifying grace is therefore Christic grace, which original grace was not. Post-fall Christic grace, sanctifying grace merited by Christ, encounters human persons from the first moment after the fall. In humans from then on inflicted by the entitative habitus of original sin. Original sin describes the state of corrupt nature. We need to talk a moment now about original sin. It describes the state of corrupt nature. Now it's important to understand what corruption is according to Thomas Aquinas. Corruption denotes nothing but the privation of the entitative habitus of original justice and the loss of original grace. Crucially, original sin is original. That is, it refers to origin. Thomas states, quote, "In this or in that individual, it is nothing else but the sin which through his origin comes to him from the first parent," unquote. This is from De Malo 4:2. What sort of reality is original sin then in every human person after the fall? Thomas states, original sin is a kind of derivation from the first parents, unquote. This is Prima Secunde 82:1, response to the second objection. Hence, it is to be understood not as something added to the human condition, but as something missing. In its essence, original sin is privative. It is the lack, the absence of that gift which humanity lost by the first parent's sin. Recall that the gift of original justice was given to human nature as an entitative habitus and was to be passed on with human nature. What is passed on now is the very deprivation of this entitative habitus, a disordered disposition rising from the dissolution of that harmony in which original justice consisted. And this disordered disposition, original sin, must itself now be called an entitative habitus, as we already stated. Because original sin is the effect of a free act of the first human couple, the deprivation of the original gift is not simply a neutral absence, but rather a culpable absence, insofar as this absence has its origin in a culpable failure of those whose nature we inherit and on the nature of which we act. Original sin being a remote cause of our actual sins. St. Thomas does not directly speak about the effects of original sin. Rather, in his discussion of the effects of actual sins, in Prima Secunde 85:3, he offers a discussion of the wounds of nature. And these wounds of nature, St. Thomas understands as the effects of the sin of the first parents. Excuse me. By having lost reason's submission to God and the interior ordering of the human powers, human nature has lost a gratuitous entitative strength, stability, and health, and finds itself in a state of instability that results in the manifold disorder of the moral faculties of the human being, so that these faculties are now beset by the wound of ignorance, affecting practical reason, the wound of malice, affecting the will, and the wounds of weakness and concupiscence, affecting the sense appetites. What is important to understand here is that in the very language descriptive of these wounds, St. Thomas retains the privative notion of original sin. The powers are wounded in virtue of being deprived of original justice. That is the original harmony of the powers of all of them ultimately subjected to God, whence they receive the right moral direction. This moral infirmity of the fallen state of humanity sets up the stage for the necessity of grace, first and foremost of healing grace. This deep reliance upon grace is a measure of the damage inflicted upon human nature by the loss of original grace and original justice. Note well that, according to St. Thomas, the grace which heals the wounds of ignorance, malice, weakness, and concupiscence does not at all imply that the natural powers of the human being are radically diseased in themselves. Grace does not heal an essential moral depravity, as some of the Protestant reformers would have it. It is not about healing a wickedness that cannot be distinguished anymore from human nature as such, human nature having become, so to speak, itself sin. Rather, grace heals the effects caused by the absence of original justice and the effects of actual sins. Recall that in Prima Secundae 85:1, St. Thomas asks whether sin can diminish the good of nature. And here he means original as well as actual sin. And he states the following, quote, "The good of human nature is threefold. First, they are the principles of which nature is constituted, and the properties that flow from these principles, such as the powers of the soul and so forth. Secondly, since the human being has from nature an inclination to virtue, this inclination to virtue is a good of nature also. And third, the gift of original justice conferred on the whole of human nature in the person of the first human being may be called also a good of nature." And then Thomas continues, "Accordingly, the first mentioned good of nature, that is, the good of the principles that constitute nature, is neither destroyed nor diminished by sin." Contra Luther, for example, also contra Jansenius, maybe. The third good of nature was entirely destroyed through the sin of our first parent. But the second good of nature, that is the natural inclination to virtue, is diminished by sin because human acts produce an inclination to like acts. Now, from the very fact that everything becomes inclined to one of two contraries, Thomas argues, its inclination to the other contrary must needs be diminished. Therefore, as sin is opposed to virtue, from the very fact that a human sins, there results a diminution of that good of nature, which is the inclination to virtue, unquote. Remember, original justice preserved the first human couple from defects stemming from human nature itself, because of its complex composition, Thomas argues. Deprived of this protection, original sin denotes first and foremost the innate defectibility of human moral powers. The defectibility of human moral powers is the remote cause of the actual sins that in turn diminish the natural inclination to virtue, what St. Thomas calls the second good of human nature. The standard of health that St. Thomas understands to be set in the state of original justice is the index of the necessity of healing grace, the first aspect of sanctifying grace, as merited by Christ. The reliance upon grace is a measure of the damage inflicted on human nature by its loss. Not only does humanity stand in need of grace in order to share again in the divine life, of course, that's the proper point of sanctifying grace, to share in the divine life, in friendship, and eventually in union of vision and love with God, but humanity also stands in need of grace as healing human individuals from the innate defectibility of human moral powers and the fallibility and instability of our moral orientation. It is crucial to understand that the economy of salvation after the fall is personal. Grace is given after the fall to the person and begins the work of restoring nature, not in general, but in each individual person. And it cannot be different. Remember, according to St. Thomas, original justice was a gift given to human nature as such, yet in the first human person, at the very moment of its constitution as human being. This situation cannot be repeated, Thomas argues. After the fall, every human person has a human nature characterized by the deprivation of original justice. The only way to address human nature now in the order of concrete existence is by way of the person. And that means by way of grace, healing and sanctifying grace. Hence, the grace merited by Christ's passion and death on the cross is communicated to the person, not to the human nature. So one can speak, according to St. Thomas, of a person who has attained grace, but one cannot speak of grace as a state of nature, nor of a state of restored nature. For that, you might want to consult Prima Secundae question 109, articles 9 and 10. Let us recapitulate. According to St. Thomas, original sin is a correlate to original justice, and both are essential entailments of a sound theology of salvation rooted in the witness of the Holy Scriptures and the theology of the Fathers. The root and center is the Pauline Adam-Christ typology, Romans 5, verses 12 through 21. And this Adam-Christ typology decisively informed the theology of salvation of Irenaeus of Lyon, Origen, Augustine, Cyril of Alexandria, and especially by way of Augustine's reception into scholastic theology, it also informed St. Thomas Aquinas in a deep way. In its essence, original sin, according to Thomas, denotes simply the state of loss of an original gift, a loss that the collective result of a free moral act in the state of original justice brought about. Salvation in Christ, according to St. Thomas, means first and foremost the restoration and surpassing perfection through the incarnate Lord's passion, death, and resurrection of the original justice and the union of charity with God, now elevated by the very perfection of charity that includes the overcoming of sin and death in the act of the Son's surpassing sacrifice in charity on the cross to the Father. Pertaining to the original state of humanity, St. Thomas argues that from the first instance on, humanity was created in an original graced union of charity with God, characterized by friendship with God and the love of God above all things. The human intellect, will, and the emotions were rightly ordered to God, the first truth and sovereign good, thus constituting an original justice worthy of and inclined toward the supernatural end to which God had ordered original humanity from the moment of its creation, the attainment of surpassing beatitude in the unitive deification of the beatific vision. The sin of the first parents issues in the loss of the original justice and graced union with God. St. Thomas characterizes the state of this absence, that is original sin, as an aversio of the will from God and as a destitutio of original justice, that is essentially the absence of what was gratuitously given to human nature in the beginning, an absence that results in the de facto inability to love God above all things, to apprehend God's surpassing holiness, glory, and praiseworthiness, and to pursue the supernatural end to which humanity was originally ordained and equipped, deification, that is the everlasting union of intellect and will with God, in vision and charity. Furthermore, this absence of original justice and graced union of charity with God has the character of sin, peccatum, and guilt, culpa, because it consists in the free loss of a good, the original communion with God, that is entailed in divine love. Original justice and original friendship with God are properties of the image of divine love, realized gratuitously in the rational creature from the beginning, an image of God's goodness and worthy, an image of God's goodness, hence the participation in God's goodness in the union of charity, and worthy of God's holiness, hence original justice. Original sin is the effect neither of a fated, unavoidable event that befell the first parents, nor of an unfortunate minor accident reflective of the immaturity and youth of the original couple, but rather is the result of a free, morally responsible act undertaken by the first parents in the intellective lucidity and volitional rectitude of original justice. According to St. Thomas, every sinful act after the fall leaves two things: a stain on the sinner's soul and the sinner's guilt that makes the sinner liable to punishment. We need to look at this for a moment now as, so to speak, the reality of original sin taking shape in the actual sins of the progeny of the first parents. Let us first consider the stain of the sinner's soul. St. Thomas argues that the human rational soul, incorporeal and therefore subsistent, immediately produced by God, has a twofold original splendor, nitor, in Latin. One from the natural light of reason, whereby humans are directed to their actions. The other from the illumination of the divine light, that is the wisdom and grace whereby humans are perfected in order to do good and fitting actions. The rational soul has one fundamental characteristic that is central to all further considerations. It is a property of its spiritual nature. It's very important for the following. When the soul cleaves to things by love, there's a kind of contact in the soul. When the soul cleaves to things by love, there's a kind of contact in the soul with a loving object. Prima Secundae, question 86, article 1. Consequently, when human beings sin, they cleave to certain things contrary to the light of reason and contrary to the divine law. The loss of the splendor of the human soul is occasioned by such contact, which, Thomas says, quote, is metaphorically called a stain on the soul. He's aware it's a metaphor. St. Thomas argues that, quote, the stain of sin remains in the soul even when the act of sin is past. For the stain denotes a blemish in the brightness of the soul on account of its withdrawing from the light of reason or of the divine law, unquote. Prima Secundae 86, 2. This stain of sin remains as long as human beings remain out of this light, that is, until they repent and return to the light of reason and to the divine law. Unless such a repentance and return occurs, the human rational soul continues to be affected by the retained habitus of its aversio, its turning away from reason and the divine law. And precisely this retained habitus constitutes the stain of sin. The second thing each actual sin leaves after the act is the sinner's liability for punishment. Here you might want to turn to De Malo, question 2, article 2, response to objection 14. This liability for punishment, that is, according to St. Thomas, the debt of punishment, debitum poene. The sinner stands in the position of a debtor in relationship to divine justice. What is actually due to the sinner under the order of divine justice is punishment, even if this punishment might not occur or be elevated into a different order. Whatever God decrees from all eternity in response to actual human sin, be it the sin of the first parent or all subsequent actual sins arising from human freedom, takes into account the sinner's position of debtor in relationship to divine justice. Actual sin, the free act of the rational creature, being either the absence of a due act in reference to God, a sin of omission, or an act contrary to what is due to God, a sin of commission, disturbs the universal order of divine governance. Actual sin introduces the reality of moral evil into the per se good order of creation and divine governance. And because God delights in the order of divine justice, the effect, Thomas argues, of a divine perfection, punishment is due as the payment that balances out the equality of justice. To simply disregard the order of divine justice or even cancel it out is, from God's side now, would, Thomas argues, entail the divine dismissal of an effect of divine perfection, namely justice, an act of divine injustice that would contradict divine wisdom and is therefore impossible. The restoration of the order of divine justice, and with it also the restoration of the balance of the equality of justice, is an entailment of the perfection of divine justice, and therefore God delights in it. For God delights in everything that is good and perfect, and that is nothing but the infinite goodness and perfection of God's own essence, and of all the perfections identical with the divine essence, Thomas argues. Hence, the debt of punishment is an immediate and unavoidable consequence of the violation of the order of divine justice. And what God has decreed to remove, the debt of divine justice is, Thomas calls, satisfaction. St. Thomas importantly observes, though, that satisfaction is not the only way to address the debt of punishment, but rather the most fitting way assigned by God to re-establish union of charity with God by way of removing the debt of punishment. By way of satisfaction, the order of divine justice is not negated, but rather elevated into the order of divine charity. Sin is not only remitted, but rather the sinner is restored to the original union of charity with God. St. Thomas argues thus: the order of divine justice could have been accommodated differently by God than by way of removing the debt of punishment by way of satisfaction. If God had somehow willed to liberate human beings from sin without satisfaction, God could have done so without acting against justice. In the third part of the Summa Theologiae, where St. Thomas considers Christ's passion, he formulates his argument in a crisply condensed form. He states, quote, "A judge, while preserving justice, cannot pardon fault without penalty, if he must visit fault committed against another. But God has no one higher than himself, for he is the sovereign and common good of the whole universe. Consequently, if God forgives sin, which has the formality of fault in that it is committed against himself, God wrongs no one, just as anyone else, overlooking a personal trespass without satisfaction, acts mercifully and not unjustly. Tertia Pars, question 46, Article 2, response to the third objection. Note well, according to St. Thomas, God is both merciful and just. Mercy is as much a divine perfection as is justice. And in the absolute simplicity of the divine essence, mercy and justice are one. It is perfectly justifiable for a judge to practice mercy without injury to justice by forgiving the sin committed against himself. Yet such mere forgiveness, as attractive as it might seem at first sight, St. Thomas argues, does not free the human soul from the stain of sin, nor restore it to the order of divine charity. Yet the substitutionary satisfaction of Christ's passion and death on the cross, as eternally decreed by God, does precisely that. While respecting the order of divine justice, it ensures first and foremost the healing of the human soul and its restoration to the original union of charity with God. What motivates St. Thomas's argument from fittingness, conveniencia, is, of course, the central datum of revelation that forms the very heart of the New Testament message, namely that Christ, by his passion, made satisfaction for the sin of the human race. Here St. Thomas is echoing 1 John chapter 2, verse 2. In order to understand why satisfaction is most suitable, convenientissimum, one must appreciate, St. Thomas argues, how the stain of sin on the human soul is removed. It is evident, St. Thomas holds, that the stain of sin cannot be removed from the soul without the soul being united to God. For after all, it was through being separated from God that the soul suffered the loss of its splendor. St. Thomas conceives of the removal of the stain of sin and the attainment of union with God thus. First and foremost, the will is the faculty of the human soul by way of which the human is united to God in via, on the way to the fatherland. And therefore the stain of sin can be removed only if the will accepts the order of divine justice. Accepting the order of divine justice is the first and fundamental step of the removal of the stain of sin on the rational soul, because this acceptance is identical with the reordering of the reason and the will to the divine law. Yet this would mean nothing short of the restoration of the original union of charity, the friendship with God, in the state of original justice. A restoration to the original union of charity with God, however, is impossible without the antecedent restoration of the sinner's reason and will to the order of divine justice. Accepting the order of divine justice means for St. Thomas one of two things. Either human beings on their own accord take upon themselves the punishment of past sins, or they bear patiently the punishment God inflicts on them. In both ways, St. Thomas says, punishment avails for satisfaction, and although satisfactory punishment, absolutely speaking, is against the will, nevertheless, in this particular case and for this particular purpose, it is voluntary. This is Prima Secundae 87:6. Already in his doctrine of sin, we encounter the central principle that governs St. Thomas's soteriology. Because a satisfactory punishment is in some way voluntary, it is transferable under one specific condition: to be one in will by the union of charity with the one who offers that satisfactory, who undergoes the satisfactory punishment. St. Thomas states, since those who differ as to the debt of punishment may be one in will by union of love, it happens that one who has not sinned bears willingly the punishment for another. Thus, even in human affairs, we see people take the debts of another upon themselves. And so one may bear another's punishment insofar as they are in some way one. Unquote. With this principle, with this central principle, I should say, St. Thomas announces the key theme that later in the third part of the Summa Theologiae unites the sacraments with the passion of Christ. Quote, Christ bore a satisfactory punishment, not for his, but for our sins. Unquote. Let us conclude. Reflecting the overarching role St. Thomas accords to charity from the state of original justice in friendship with God in the beginning to the surpassing perfection of charity in the beatific vision, St. Thomas advances the argument from fittingness that a voluntary satisfaction in charity actually be most suitable, convenientissimum, for healing the soul from the stain of sin and for restoring it to the union of charity with God. In the state of original justice, because of the gift of sanctifying grace, humans adhered to God by charity. Original sin destroyed this adherence by charity to humanity's final end, union with God. So what is at stake in satisfactory punishment is twofold. First, satisfaction restores the order of charity by way of a substitutionary satisfaction accepted voluntarily in charity for the person wronged and for the wrongdoer. Second, substitutionary satisfaction presupposes a union of charity between the wrongdoer and the person who makes satisfaction. Remember, St. Thomas holds that, quote, when a soul cleaves to things by love, there's a kind of contact in the soul, unquote. If the wrongdoer loves the person who makes satisfaction for him or her, there is a kind of contact in the soul of the wrongdoer with this person. And if this person is a divine person, there's a kind of contact in the soul of the wrongdoer with God. Christ is the divine person, who in his human nature is priest and victim in one, who offered in his passion and death voluntarily a substitutionary satisfaction for all human sin, and more importantly, in a supreme act of unitive charity with God the Father. Christ's satisfaction for human sin in charity, both to the Father and to the wrongdoer, allows for, invites, and by way of sanctifying grace, brings about a restoration of charity through which the human being adheres again to his or her final end, union with God. And adhering to God through charity inchoately attaches the soul to God such that the soul's splendor is restored. Thus humans become again what they were created for in the beginning, to be in virtue of their union in charity with God, imitators, and thereby living images of God. The need for grace turns out to be, according to St. Thomas, the need for Christic grace. And that grace, it turns out, takes its specific character from Christ's salvific passion and death on the cross of Golgotha. This grace is merited by Christ. It heals the wounded soul. It restores friendship with God in charity and is ordered to the divinizing union with God, a created participation in the uncreated beatitude of the triune God, which is the surpassing beatitude of the human being, the supernatural end to which humanity was ordained in the beginning. This Christic grace delivers humanity from its greatest need, the detrimental consequences of original and actual sin, and restores us to righteousness and friendship with God. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Hütter, for this way from the original justice to the Christic grace. It has been wonderful. Thank you very much. Es tiempo para alguna pregunta. Si alguno quiere alguna pregunta. Yes, one question.
First of all, thank you very much for this conference. It was very profound and synthetic, so very many thanks. Secondly, I apologize for my English. I will try to be clear as I can be.
Your English is much better than my Spanish, so fine.
Okay. Well, this is my question. It's about concupiscencia. You think it could be said that the conflict between the rational part and the material part, so to say, it's in some way a natural conflict? It's something that derives directly, so to say, of the composition of the soul and the body, or it's just something due to the original sin? I don't know if you understand the question.
Both. It is both. There is, according to Thomas, I'm giving you first Thomas's argument as I understand it, there is concupiscencia, has a natural root precisely in the delicate composition of the human being, where, so to speak, extreme opposites, a spiritual substance and material components are held together in one. That is extraordinary in the created cosmos. Angels don't have that, animals don't have that. Only the human being has that. Original justice was meant to overcome and stabilize that. With the loss of original justice, we don't have just the natural state anymore, but now concupiscencia is intensified because human nature is actually somewhat weakened by the loss of original justice. So concupiscencia, it's like a person. I always say to my students, when you have had a pneumonia once, you're much more likely to catch another one. So in other words, as a proclivity towards sin, this concupiscencia is now a somewhat, so to speak, a stronger potency towards sin than simply in the state supposedly before original justice was given. But that's a hypothetical state of nature. We never had that.
Yeah.
But Thomas would argue, makes a twofold argument. There is an inherent instability in human nature due to its very delicate, let's say, extreme composition. Original justice was a way to stabilize human nature from first moment on, caused by sanctifying grace. But it was an enditive habitus granted to the human in communion with God, a help. The culpable loss of that has done something to concupiscencia, not making it an active force like in Martin Luther or in the Reformation theology, but the potency is now stronger because the human has been weakened in a certain way, a human nature. The loss of sanctifying grace, the culpable loss, is not simply now a neutral absence, but something that has had an impact on human nature, weakening impact.
Okay, thanks.
Thomas is walking a very fine line here, as you know from the history of that, between, let's say, the Jesuit theology of Suarez and others of a pure nature theology on the one hand, and the Jansenists and the Lutherans on the other. I'm trying to keep the very fine Thomistic line here and not fall down one or the other side.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Professor, I have another question. How can we help the people to understand the depth of punishment because of sin, and the convenience of, in a certain way, the necessity of suffering to repair the consequence of sin?
Well, it's clear there is no, so to speak, natural understanding of that. This cannot happen, so to speak, by way of a philosophical argument and by way of reason. This is an entailment of the faith. By coming to faith and by a deepening of the faith, especially by a focus on Christ's passion and death, on the cross and its salvific nature, what that entails, so to speak, what is, so to speak, the full depth of that, what can we learn from that? That is the way, the only way I think we can help others and ourselves to appreciate, to come closer to this deep mystery of the faith. It is not easily accessible. I mean, you know what it took a Teresa of Avila and some others of the mystics in Spain, St. John, to approach this deep mystery. And I think it's very important in Thomas that when we discuss the need for grace, we end up with him not simply in the treatise of grace, but meditate on and contemplate Christ's passion and death on the cross as a divine act, as a divine human act for our salvation. It means going back to St. Paul in the letter to the Romans and in 1 Corinthians, that is in many ways the source, the interpretive source, the first source we have next to the Gospels of entering that hidden situation, that hidden from our normal view. It is only revelation that can open that up to us and to all of humanity. It's otherwise hidden. And without faith, it remains for many something not only hidden, but a foolishness and something offensive, especially to the modern mind, that has recaptured some of the pride of the fall, an original pride. It is very offensive. The word of the cross is a great offense. And so we stand in the middle of that struggle with a message that for many is an offense, and hope that grace opens eyes and hearts, that people can discover the mercy of God and the grace of God in the message of and in the reality of the cross as our healing, as healing grace. That what heals us is in a way God's own love and humility as it is displayed on the cross in the human act of the divine Son. But it is in the end always, it is an act of faith, and it is an appeal to faith. It is at the heart of Thomas's theology. There is no philosophical access to that, I think. Only in preparation, so to speak. There are certain analyses one can take in preparing people to begin to open up in that direction. But the real embrace, the real encounter requires the illumination of faith.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, ¿alguna pregunta más? Well, Professor, thank you very much. We are so pleased to have you with us, and we hope that you will return here to Balmesiana again. Well, God bless you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a great honor for me. Goodbye. Auf Wiedersehen.
Bueno, pues hasta mañana si Dios quiere. Ahora y vísperas, perdón.